Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm extremely honoured to be chairing this panel of very august speakers for you to enlighten you and to maybe give some food for thought for a discussion for the next hour and a half or so. It's a privilege to be coming and to be following on from the three Nuffield scholars that we had this morning. I was very much struck by all the presentations and how much their findings really do have a bearing and a lending to the actual topic of today's conference, because they are, all of them, in terms of that research, as part of the solution as well to the challenges that are facing the industry. So I very much commend the work that they've done, and it's an absolute pleasure to see the leadership that's coming through in terms of the Nuffield scholars. So thank you very much for that. The topic of today's discussion and this morning's discussion is about future trends for agri-food policy and how the sector needs to respond to that. We're all aware of the challenges, the triple challenges that are facing the sector in terms of the absolute priority and need that we have for providing safe and nutritious food, the need to protect and enhance our own livelihoods, both producers and the communities, and that came up in the topics this morning, and also obviously to produce in an environmentally sustainable way. So obviously in the context of COP26 and what's been happening in the last 2 weeks, the environmental sustainability is understandably, and the focus of that is understandably to the fore, but equally important obviously is to address the economic and the social aspects of sustainability as well in that three-pillar structure. Reducing greenhouse gases by, at a minimum, 22% is, over the next decade, is obviously going to be a significant challenge to us, and particularly on farm. So I suppose collectively we have to ensure that in achieving that the economic sustainability of our grass-based farming models and also of our rural communities are equally to the fore in any national debate on agri-food policy. So I've said we've a great panel for you who are going to cover all of these topics. And they're going to challenge you also to consider what solutions there might be for the sector in order to face up to those challenges. We have Declan Kelleher, who was formerly the permanent representative of Ireland to the European Union in Brussels, and he stepped down there in March of last year, 2020. We have Tom Arnold, who you are all aware of, who's chair of many things, but in the context of this discussion this morning, chair of the 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee. And we have two great Nuffield scholars, and it's a privilege to have both of them here today. So we have Karina Pierce, who's Associate Professor in UCD, and also Tadhg Buckey, who is Director of Policy, Chief Economist with the IFA, and also Nuffield Scholar. I've suggested that maybe Declan Kelleher maybe start the discussion, because he brings a wealth of international experience and knowledge, very much for an international scene. He's going to set the international scene for us. As I mentioned, Declan was permanent representative of Ireland from September 2013 up to March of 2020. Prior to that, he was ambassador for 9 years in China. So he has really a great wealth of experience on the international scene. He's got previous postings also in Washington, D.C. and in the UN, and senior posts back in Ireland on the Anglo-Irish, Northern Irish matters and foreign policy and EU questions. So this is the man to talk to in terms of setting the scene, and if we have some time, we might ask him a couple of questions also on Article 16. But I'd recommend that any of you to follow him on Twitter as well, because he's certainly, he's a mine of information and a great authority on all things EU-UK relations. So Declan, I'd like to pass it on to you to say a couple of words on what your thoughts are in terms of the international perspective and the challenges facing the Irish agri-food industry. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Anne. And let me also very briefly at the outset thank Karina Nuffield for inviting me to be here today and giving me the opportunity to sit with this extremely distinguished panel. I'm not an agricultural expert, but as Anne says, I'll just give you a flavour of some of the broad lines of EU approach and also the more global approach. I think in the European Union, I'd just like to make three things at the start. I'm sure you know these, but I'll just mention them just for the sake of completeness. that the Common Agricultural Policy has a €10 billion fund for 5 years, 60% direct, 40% rural development. Ireland is to submit its CAP strategic plan by the end of this year, and this will be evaluated by the Commission for the 5-year period 2023 to 2027. Secondly, you know that you see it now with the COP in Glasgow, that the European Union is a major player in this whole area of climate change. And if you like, the key new approach by the EU is the Fit for 55 approach. You know, that reduced emissions by 55% in 2030 over 1990 levels. Agriculture is not the main theme of that at the moment. It's essentially buildings and transport. But agriculture will come into this, I think, in a fairly intense way quite soon. And again, for the sake of completeness, let me just set out, I presume everybody's aware of what the European Commission's view is in relation to Ireland and agriculture at the moment, because I think this will be important as a scene setter. First of all, you know the concerns of the Commission on livestock concentration. Greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are rising. Ireland is missing its target on ammonia emissions, and those emissions are also rising. The impact of livestock on water, in the opinion of the Commission, is very serious, and livestock numbers are growing. Now, the vast majority of agricultural produce is exported from Ireland, about 40% into the UK. There is, the Commission notes, very little organic farming in Ireland, although the EU market has been growing dramatically. The nutrient cycle, in their view, needs a lot of attention, but the sustainability of the whole farming model is, if you like, is raising questions. On the other hand, Ireland has opportunities to invest in peatlands and store carbon, and in the terms of those opportunities, the Commission sees opportunities in carbon farming, agroforestry and peatlands, circular approaches, that's to say biogas, closer cooperation along the chain, and that basically decodes as the EU Code of Conduct for Sustainable Business and Marketing Practices. I know you will all have strong views on some of this, but I felt it just useful at the outset just to set out where the kind of the issues are at the moment in EU terms. One other point I would mention, and I think it's quite important, I personally think it could be a big part of the solution, is the EU's approach on the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAMs. This, as you know, is a tax or a tariff, and it's designed to guard against carbon leakage. It could be a major defence for the EU and for Irish agriculture against, if you like, imports of less carbon-friendly agriculture from Brazil and Latin America. I think that is something, again, just worth thinking about. Going more broadly onto the geopolitical context, I think we have to recognise that, leaving aside the issues of agriculture and climate change, the multilateral system, which has basically been in operation since the end of the Second World War, that is to say the UN and its associated bodies, is in crisis. We in Ireland subscribe to something called the rules-based international order, but many countries, Russia, China, even 1 or 2 European countries, don't subscribe to that. So there is a governance competition at the global level, there's a battle of narratives at the global level, and some are even calling into question, even in Europe, normal democratic norms. This, to go from the more general theoretical approach to the specific, does have implications for agriculture. Climate change is intimately linked with the pandemic situation, and agriculture in China has been associated with that. You also have the problems of migration that will occur from those parts of the world most affected by global warming in the coming years. You have erosion of natural resources, which goes in hand with that. You have also even the whole process of decarbonisation and creating circularity raises its own security challenges. Access to raw materials, value chain management, and the transition from fossil fuels will probably cause instabilities in certain parts of the world. You probably saw the Saudi government the other day being quite vocal on this at COP. So there is a range of issues that have to be addressed, and they will provide an overall context to what we're talking about today. The European Union, let me make clear, has started to think about this. And there is something, I know it's an odd name, but there's something called the Strategic Compass, which is going to be considered by the European Union at heads of government level fairly soon. And that's an overall approach to security which will kind of touch on climate change and touch on those problems that I've just mentioned. Another aspect globally that I think is very important and is an asset and a plus is finance. And what has happened is that big business, big finance, has suddenly realized that the future is in green approaches. They've mainstreamed green approaches. So for example, in the US, the SEC is now insisting that big companies disclose their risks in terms of climate change. It's no longer niche, it's actually mainstream. Now the European Union has helped to push this, and there is a thing, Mairead McGuinness, who's the Commissioner for Finance, has brought forward a thing called the taxonomy of green investments. Now that will be, if you like, a multiplier of support for the kinds of finance that could be made available and that I think would be of considerable interest to Irish agriculture. Mark Carney, who's the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Climate Change, is talking about raising $100 trillion. And so private finance has been mobilized, and as well as government and EU finance, it is a real potential asset. And if it's not going to be spent here, it'll be spent in other places. And finally, let me just talk about a couple of the more difficult domestic questions that exist. I mean, there is globally a balance that has to be struck between reducing emissions on the one hand and enhancing mitigations and resilience on the other hand. And mitigations and resilience, I think, are intimately tied up with innovation. And again, that goes back to the potential from finance. The balance has to be struck, and buy-in is a huge problem. And I think there is a serious issue here in Ireland about the unbalanced narrative that's taken place, the demonization, if you like, of Irish agriculture, which I think is wrong and I think is very unfortunate. I think that debate has to be evened up, and I think it's something for Irish agriculture to look at occupying that space, to, if you like, colonize the airwaves, to move ahead and actually set out your position, not in a defensive way, but in a very proactive way. I think that's important. And to explain the trade-offs, because the trade-offs will affect every person on the island of Ireland. And I think that is also something which needs to be explained. And you then have one fundamental, very serious, if you like, almost philosophical problem that has to be looked at. Everybody is being told they have to take certain measures to save the planet. But the planet is future and unborn generations, people whose names, in a sense, we may not even know. I think that issue has to be unpacked more, and the question of fairness and the question of sustainability has to be at the heart of it, and also responsibility. It's a very tricky one, but I think it's something that needs to be looked at. And finally, and Anne, you've been very, very tolerant because I've gone a little over time. I just want to address the question of China, because I hear a lot the argument that, well, why should we do anything when China is a massive emitter and is doing nothing? Well, first of all, I think per capita, Ireland's emissions are higher than China's, but I'll leave that to one side. But actually, the reality is, even though the Chinese don't say it, because they don't particularly want to be beholden to the US or the EU or the international community, there is a huge amount happening in China, which again is quite remarkable and essentially stems from a decision by the Chinese government that their existing economic model of smokestack production, low added value, cheap goods for Western consumers has run out of road. So now they're essentially mainstreaming green energy, not as something, a concession to the rest of the world, but as a driver for their own economic growth. So China will reach peak cement in 2023. It will reach peak steel in 2025. Solar and wind is expanding enormously in China. Some of you may have heard of or even have seen the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is the biggest hydroelectric dam in the world. There are 3 to 5 Three Gorges dams worth of additional solar power alone coming on stream in China on a yearly basis. So 50% of new electricity vehicles in the world globally are sold in China. So China is not making a trade-off. China has actually embarked on a new economic model in which green will be a fundamental part of it. And that also serves the purpose of the Chinese leadership. It keeps their people happy. China, as you know, is not a democracy. It's an authoritarian, communist, in their own words, dictatorship. So it's something which they're pushing forward. And I think we have to be aware of that. And I think, again, China will, over the next few years, for reasons which are purely nationalistic on their part, will suddenly come to the fore in terms of the big effort that we're making on emissions and climate change. I think it's as well to be aware of that. And thank you very much. You said you'd give me a little bit more time. I hope I haven't trespassed on that too much, but I hand back to you.
Not at all, Declan, and thank you very much. And it really is an excellent setting of the scene. And I think you've covered a number of the key issues which are facing us on an international scene. But I asked you challenges, but also a number of opportunities there, which we may come back to in terms of the discussion. I'm going to move on to Tom. Tom is currently serving as chair of the EU Commission's high-level expert group to assess the need for an international platform for food system science. So it's a fairly impressive title. But I think we know him much more. He also obviously has been special envoy on the food systems and a member of the Champion Network for the UN Food Systems Summit this year. So that's important. We know him more as the chair of the Irish 2030 Agri Food Strategy Committee. And I think Tom has to be absolutely commended on the work of that committee that's gone on for the last 18 months and concluded in a strategy that really sets out a framework for the industry and for the sector for the next decade. There's a couple of unique aspects and attributes to that particular strategy. It was based on a food systems approach, which I'm going to ask Tom to speak to a bit, and the significance of that. And it also has a very ambitious vision for the sector out to 2030, and that is to become a world leader in sustainable food systems. And it's a good segue into what Declan has been talking about in terms of the perception of Ireland and how we're perceived and the challenges that are facing us. So Tom, would you mind setting out the scene for the strategy and how that will assist the sector, and also maybe speak to the overall ambition for the sector in terms of sustainable food systems? Thank you, Tom.
With pleasure, Anne. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for the invitation to be part of this extremely positive gathering that we've started on. Just to put Food Vision 2030 is what this strategy is called, but just to put it in context, I mean, it's the 6th such strategy since the year 2000. So that's the way Ireland has developed its strategies over the last 20 years. And they've all been done using what's called a multi-stakeholder approach. So in other words, the people who are concerned and relevant to strategies have been around the table as they were developed. In this particular case, it was a 32-person stakeholder committee, which I had the pleasure of chairing. And we were given terms of reference, which were, I think, very clear. We were asked to outline a vision for the agri-food sector up till 2030, which enabled the sector to become sustainable in its 3 dimensions: economic, environmental, and social. This is a very important foundation stone of what we were asked to do. And as Anne, it should also be said that we were established in November 2019. We were looking at a context into which we had to frame our strategy. And within 2 months, there were some fairly significant changes in that context. The first was that in December 2019, the European Commission published its European Green Deal. So that basically raised the bar in terms of environmental expectation from then on. And of course, that was then supplemented and further accentuated in 2020 with the outcome of the election in Ireland and the Green Party entering government, and the programme for government itself building in a much more ambitious environmental target nationally and by extension for agriculture than had been the case before. The other outstanding issue, which was unresolved when we started our work, was of course Brexit. And Brexit, we clearly could not finish a strategy for the next decade until we had some sense about what the outcome of the Brexit negotiations was going to be. That only resolved itself to, at least to a certain degree, on Christmas Eve of 2020. And the third big thing that nobody had envisaged was COVID. So the world in which we were planning our strategy looked very different as we started our work than when we were asked to do it. A first crucial decision that was taken at our first working meeting in January of 2020 was indeed this commitment or this decision to adopt what's called a food systems approach. Now that's a term that's been getting increased currency internationally in the last few years, but of course it has to be adapted to the circumstances of each individual country. Each country has its own food system, its own history of food, its own characteristic of the sector that it is involved in. Ireland is, quite an outlier in terms of the agri-food system it has. I mean, it's more aligned to New Zealand than anywhere else in terms of the dominance of the livestock grass-fed sector. So as we started our work in January of 2020 and using a food systems approach. So what did that mean in Irish terms? Well, we said what it really meant was a recognition of the interconnectedness of the agri-food sector to certain other crucial sectors. And the certain other crucial sectors most relevant to Ireland was to the environment and climate and to nutrition and health. Now, in earlier strategies, particularly Foodwise 2025, there had been, of course, the recognition of the link between the agri-food sector and the environment. It wasn't quite followed through on that one, but it was there. What was actually quite different and innovative for the Food Vision 2030 was that we recognized the important link with nutrition and health. And that is, again, recognizing something in a wider global context. The world is facing a major challenge in terms of what's happening in terms of overweight and obesity and all the consequences that has for public health systems and public finance systems in the years ahead. So we, in our strategy, acknowledged that and began to put in place suggestions as to how to deal with that. So what was the outcome after effectively 18 months' work of this committee? The outcome was a draft strategy, which was finalized in April of this year, which was then put out for further public consultation, which took 2 months. And then that strategy, on the basis of what was submitted during that 2-month period, was finalized by the committee in July and signed off by government in August. The core conclusion is that Ireland wants to become a leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade. That's the what, that's the objective. How to do it is set out at the heart of what's in the strategy in what's 4 missions. A climate-smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector, viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being, food that is safe, nutritious and appealing, trusted and valued at home and abroad, and fourthly, an innovative, competitive and resilient agri-food sector driven by technology and talent. And for each of these high-level missions, there are a set of goals and particular other targets, policies that are set down as to achieve that. So this really is a very significant ambition that is set out in this document. And the real significance of this is that this is setting the policy framework for Ireland for the next decade. And into this policy framework, which is at certain it is high level, but into this must then fit subsequent subsidiary decisions that are going to have to be taken year by year. And the first one of those is obviously the CAP strategic plans that Declan talked about, which have been developed now. A draft has been developed in Ireland, having involved a lot of consultation here, and submitted to Brussels for its comment. And out of that process of consultation with Brussels will emerge an agreed CAP strategic plan for Ireland to be operated, to be put in place from early 2023. So the significance then of our food vision document is that it provides the overall framework into which the CAP strategic plans will operate. And not just the CAP strategic plans, there are other things coming down the tracks as well. Obviously, the review of the nitrates directive is going to fit into that same category. And then, of course, we have, and particularly relevant this week, we have the consequences of not only the global effort with what's being decided at COP, but the national dimension of that, which is the climate action plan and the allocation of carbon budgets to the sector. And the detail of that, what that will involve in practical terms, remains to be worked out. Our strategy document was clear in that it put as mission number one a climate-smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector, and set down 7 goals within that. The ambitious goals, basically the policy directions, the policy measures that would have to be taken in place in order to achieve that climate-smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector. But we recognized that there was more decisions were coming down the line to be decided after we had finished our work. And preeminent among those is the allocation of carbon budgets and the decisions that would flow from that. Now, what we have said in our Food Vision 2030 is we acknowledge that there are currently environmental challenges to be faced, and they have to indeed be faced up to. And there's going to be more, if you like, specificity about the scale of those challenges when we work through the consequences of the carbon budgets. But the other key thing to be said is that we are also spelling out in Mission 1 of our strategy that it's not just meeting those targets, it's also putting in place a policy framework to enable the agri-food sector to contribute to the solution of the challenges that are facing. And so, for example, in the whole area of carbon farming, we're at a very early stage yet, but that is something that is going to have to become more emphasized. And I just maybe finish by saying that I agree profoundly with what Declan talked about, this notion of how the sector has been viewed, if you like, or has in the last while. I think there's been an excessive polarization of opinion between the agricultural world and the environmental world. That is unproductive, to put it at its mildest, and we need to get to the point where we have a much clearer sense of a common ground between these two sectors and to work to a program to achieve that common ground. I believe that what we have set down in our Food Vision 2030 can be a basis for that, but it's going to require a lot more discussion, a lot more willingness to compromise to go down that road. Just in final conclusion, where do we go from here with the Food Vision 2030? It's a decade-long vision. There's a lot of things suggested in it. we have to start somewhere, and we have to start with the implementation. And there is an implementation committee about to start its work on the 24th of November. It will be chaired by the Minister for Agriculture. It will have the stakeholders around the table. And what that really will have to do is, year by year, 3 years by 3 years, set down the really priority measures that need to be taken and set in place the monitoring arrangements to ensure that these are put in place and acted upon. So, Anne, I'll stop at that and hope that gives the sort of overview that is relevant.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent overview, and I think it really puts in context of what is the strategy, and with really key messages out there that it is not a standalone strategy on its own. It really is interlinked with a number of other strategies which are coming down the line with us. But this strategy is built in such a way that it can incorporate the other policies which have yet to be finalised in a number of different areas, whether it be on CAP strategy or indeed on the environmental side. I think that's a good sort of setting the scene in terms of the future of agricultural food policy. It's very much incorporated and encapsulated in the strategy itself. I suppose the second part of the discussion, though, and that really is where the rubber hits the road, is how does the sector need to respond to all of that? Because we are really faced with a daunting task. If you can understand that the strategy itself has 4 missions. I think it's 22 goals and over 200 action points, and that's acknowledging that actually it isn't even fully complete, because there are a number of different policies that have yet to be finalised, and will also have an impact on future policy. But the sector is facing this task, and so the question is, how do we address it? How does the industry respond to all of this now? I'm going to ask Karina to say a few words. She's an associate professor for dairy production in UCD. She's a Nuffield scholar and a board member as well. And she's currently a member of Board Bia's Dairy Subsidiary Group, and was also a member of the Teagasc Authority and was former president of the ASA. Okay. Yeah. Karina's looked at the role that the R&D and innovation sector research and development innovation sector can play in providing solutions for the industry. And I'm going to ask her just to say a few words. She's got some interesting ideas there, and some of it's emanating from her Nuffield research work as well, in terms of that sectoral response at a certain level that maybe have implications for other parts of the sector as well. Yep.
Thanks, Anne, and it is a privilege to be here today to address you all and to be part of this really excellent panel, so thank you for the opportunity. So I suppose a key response, as I would see it, Anne, has to be a strong investment in research and innovation in the agri-food sector. And I suppose over the last couple of years, I think we've really seen the importance of research and innovation as we've battled our way through the pandemic. And I think, again, the importance of research and innovation has been highlighted as the agri-food sector, I think, comes to terms with the very ambitious targets for the industry and how we're going to deal and meet those. So I suppose between my role in UCD and also my research topic for my Nuffield project was looking at the importance of the research and innovation system in terms of providing solutions to transform the food system that Tom has talked about into more sustainable, resilient, competitive and inclusive pathways. And I think while there are many positives about our research and innovation system in Ireland, I think we need to look at maybe the areas where we can improve on if we're to move forward. There's very significant public funding goes into research and innovation. In 2018, that was around 157 million. And so I think better coordination of that is really necessary to ensure value for money, to avoid duplication, and also, I think importantly, to identify gaps in knowledge so that we can move effectively to plan a future research and innovation programme. So where do we need to go to next? And I think as we plan future research programmes, that we need to maybe take a broader look than we've done before, a more holistic approach, encompassing, again, it's hard to say all of the food chain or all of the food system, but certainly more of it. So we've a greater focus on production and its link with nutrition and health, and Tom also alluded to that as well, and also the interconnection with the environment, with climate change and alternative land use options. So, you know, that isn't an easy task, and I think will require meaningful collaboration. So to be transformative, I think we need to move away from component-type research, and what I mean by that is where we look at one specific piece of it, and researchers are really good at doing that, and, you know, to be more broadly focused, or a more systems approach that incorporates all elements. And that in some ways means a much longer term approach to research than we've taken. You know, where we're looking at, you know, maybe industry want immediate results, and that might be 2 years, or we've, you know, excellent funding from the Department of Agriculture, but you're looking at a 4-year programme. I mean, some of this, when we're looking at the impacts on biodiversity, on soil fertility, on genetics, on water quality, take a much longer time to actually see impact. So I think we need a longer term view. And also, given the complexity of some of the issues, we really need to see a fostering of, you know, a collaborative environment around key industry issues, you know, that are critical for us. And that, you know, so that science is translated into strong business, strong policy, and strong management decisions. And there's, because of the scale of the investment required for this, there's going to be a greater need for the private sector to be involved. And I think in many ways there's a positive to that. But also I think private sector involvement can threaten the perceived independence of research. And I saw that particularly when I attended the UN FAO Committee on Food Security meetings 2 years ago. And you have the private sector mechanism in one room, and we're talking, you know, about, you know, the need for innovation, the need for technology to solve the problems of the industry. And you go into another room, and it's the consumer or the citizen groups who are talking the complete opposite, a mistrust of technology, a mistrust of some of the innovation, you know, to solve problems, that we need to go back to methods of old to get us out of the issues. So there's a huge divide. So I think communication around that, to bridge that gap, to build transparency and build trust, I think are going to be really, really key. So just a couple of finishing comments. I think greater oversight and coordination, maybe that's through a single government department, it's through a committee, it's through appointing a head of agri-food research and innovation that will pull all of these disparate pieces apart. So, you know, to make more of the individual parts. And then a need for a national agri-food research and innovation policy too, that gives direction to strategy and to investment. So I think, just to sum it up, if we're going to realise the potential that research and innovation offers to solve our problems, we need greater cohesion, greater collaboration, and we need better communication.
And I think it's those 3 points, cohesion, collaboration and communication, are absolutely essential to maybe all of the sector's response, and how we are actually going to really move the dial and shift the dial on all of this. Karina, we'll probably come back to a number of those points, but I definitely want to introduce and to bring in Tadhg at this stage. Tadhg is, Buckley is Director of Policy, Chief Economist with the IFA, only since December. So, but he's previously been head of agriculture with the AIB Bank, we've known him, and another Nuffield scholar. He's also actively involved in the dairy farm in North Cork. So, Tadhg, I've asked you to maybe just give us some feeling for what you think in terms of how does the sector need to respond with your current and maybe your past hat as well, in terms of the of your position. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and it's great to be sharing a stage with such luminaries as are on my left-hand side. So I suppose, I was just putting my thoughts together, you know, over the last week or so, and I think listening as well to what the other panelists have just said, and I think it's really interesting. There's the way that it has evolved already. So Declan, you know, gave an excellent oversight in terms of the, you know, the European and global context. And there was, you know, if you look at the content of and I suppose the key points that Declan was making and the key points that is coming from Europe, you know, I think there's nothing in that there's plenty of opportunities that offers. first of all. So, and I think as well there's a responsibility at EU level from a policy perspective to make sure that there's fairness across the value chain and the food value chain in Europe. And what I mean by that, and again Declan has already addressed it, it's I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a huge part of it, because it's very clear where the EU wants to go in terms of their direction from a food policy perspective. But you can only, if you want to go that direction, you have to put in the protections that guard from real damage being done to the EU food value chain. So that's the first thing. And secondly, in relation to finance was mentioned, I think the Sustainable Finance Directive, which was mentioned as well, is a huge part of this. So we'll talk about agricultural policy, but the way finance policy is going to evolve, both in terms of at a public level, but also the way that the financial institutions themselves will evolve, I think is going to have a huge impact as well in terms of development. And I suppose I've had personal experience of that in the past. But as well as that then, I mean, one of the things, if you look at, say, the food value chain, and I'm concentrating on that for a small bit because I think it ties in very well with the food systems approach that Tom has addressed. So actually, I mean, looking at the food systems approach, if you look at the way the FAO had defined it, the three parts of it were that it was profitable throughout the value chain, throughout the food system. It has a positive or neutral environmental impact, and it has broader base benefits for society, which touches on the three pillars that Tom said in terms of sustainability, both social, economic and environmental. And now if you look at in Ireland, the Commission did a study on the the food value chain in Ireland in 2016 was the last one that was done. And in Ireland, the primary producers' share of the food value chain in Ireland was 18% versus an EU average of 25%. And so I think now we do export a lot, which does, probably cloud that a small bit. But I suppose the bottom line, though, is that as part of addressing the challenge we have, there is a need to try and address the value chain imbalances. And I think that the Food Ombudsman introduction of that as part of the EU policy related that has a hugely important role to play as well. And you look at food prices in Ireland, retail food prices in Ireland have fallen every year for the last 7 years at retail level. They've fallen by about 11%. In the same period, alcohol and tobacco prices have gone up by 15%. Now, a lot of that is taxation related, but it just goes to show, and I suppose there's a lot of talk about making sure that it's properly that maybe that emissions should be priced at farm level. When you look at it, you go, well, it's that what we call an externality. It's not being priced into food prices at the moment. So, and it's about the fairness again. So it's how do we try and address that imbalance? So I suppose that's and if we move on to what Tom has spoken about, and I think that the Agri Food 2030 strategy gives us a really good roadmap. And I know it was prior to the Climate Act being fully, and the carbon budget being fully implemented, but actually it's completely fit for purpose in terms of where we need to go from here for the next number of years. There's just a bit of, I suppose, in terms of the where we have to get to from an emissions abatement perspective, we just have a bit further to travel than was originally envisaged. But really, that food strategy and the approach from the food systems approach, I think is really important and offers big opportunities. And I suppose moving then on to the research side of it, I mean, if we look at what the carbon budget set out from the climate plan that was published last week, so we're looking at something around, we've to abate between 5 and 7 million tonnes of carbon agriculture between now and 2030. Now we have if you look first of all at the MAC curve, that gives us 2 million tonnes. So we could start there. And what I think the research and innovation need as much as anything else is time and space to get us to the I mean, we've got the low-hanging fruit that we can take out that can get us a part of the ways there. It gives us time as well for our colleagues in the research side of it they need time and space, and absolutely, I mean, I think Karina said it very well in terms of the importance of collaboration across that as well, across public and private on that side of it, to make sure that we can, first of all, adopt the technology at farm level, and second, well, I suppose, develop the technology and properly adopt it. And then, I suppose, just to finish, there's plenty of opportunities there as well. The carbon farming was mentioned, the circular economy was mentioned. Again, I think two very, very valid opportunities. And what we need to do at national level is develop enabling policies around them as well. And I suppose what I mean by that is, if you look at, say, one example is the renewable energy side of it. At the moment, we're 23rd out of 27 member states in terms of our adoption of renewable technology. And really, why is that? Well, one of the main reasons is that our policy at a micro-generation level hasn't been fit for purpose. And I think that we need to have enabling policies that allow farmers because farmers want to be part of the solution, of course they do. But they also, I mean, they need to be given the levers to do that. So renewable energy is one opportunity, because we need to adopt that. It's part of the climate plan. If you take our dairy industry from running dryers, you need biogas to run those dryers, and so we have to address it in terms of the challenge. But there's a massive opportunity there as well. Fonterra at the moment, 39% of their energy that they use is from coal. So, I mean, first of all, we need biogas to address that challenge from a sustainability perspective. But look at what it could offer us if we can address that challenge before some of our competitors do. And I mean, and again, it offers the opportunity to diversify. So, I mean, a lot of talk is about farmers. They need to diversify. Absolutely, they do, but they need to be able to see that and see the opportunity. And I think one of the things we've got to understand is that if you look at the Teagasc analysis, about a third of our farmers are viable at the moment in terms of how Teagasc address it. And it's very hard to focus on the big picture long term in terms of the climate challenge if you're struggling to make a living. And I think we've probably got to understand that ourselves in terms of, at an industry level, about how do we allow farmers to see how they actually just see a proper, rather than an abstract about talking about how we want to be part of the solution, but like, what does that mean? And I think that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's how you bring your policy down from European and global level down through national policy research and down to the farmer level.
So it's the practicalities on the ground, is actually seeing what can be achieved on the ground. Because, I mean, the obvious question is we have a great framework for a food policy there. It seems to be broadly accepted throughout the sector that that's really where we are. But how do we move from that framework and the implementation to actual practicalities? Because there is a sense of urgency at the same time, certainly at the citizens' level, that things need to move on. To your point, that there is, there are plenty of there's plenty of progress that we can make already without having to maybe wait for all of the whole scene to be set for us, because that will never happen. It's a constant changing, moving.
Yeah,
thing,
it's like the saying, like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Correct.
So
yeah.
I mean, I think that's we've got to start now, and and I think, starting and I suppose making progress will allow us to, I think, will maybe help remove us a bit from the focal point, because agriculture is like front and centre of the whole debate at the moment. And obviously I'd share the panel's view in terms of there's a lot of unfairness about the narrative around that. But how do we try and remove ourselves from it? It's about I think we've got to change the narrative a bit, and to say that we accept that we have a role to play, but we also need to make sure it's fair, the fairness side of it, which I think a lot of the commentary about agriculture from the various parts of the media can be quite unfair, and that then it obviously annoys farmers, and then you get reaction from that, and that's how the whole thing starts. And you've got your you rotate for that from there.
Tom, know that this came up in terms of the discussion with the committee itself and in terms of framing the strategy, and now you've moved on to the implementation. So, like, what learnings are there for us, and what really focus should there be in terms of that implementation to make it the success that it needs to be?
Well, I think we have a starting point in terms of an overall vision, broad policy framework. We specifically on this issue of the environment, we now have, if you like, updated, clearer policies or targets that have to be addressed. So I think it's a matter of, now as Tadhg says, getting on with it. And I think we do need to make sure that we are putting in place as early as possible, and I would say this is where the first meeting of the implementation committee on the 4th of November comes into play, putting in place a number of measures that can be acted upon quickly and that can be seen to be responding to the most up-to-date challenges. But there also should be some sense that some of the other measures on the other side of the equation, you know, the way in which farmers can proactively contribute to this agenda and can actually gain from this agenda, because there has to be, I think we have to be moving towards, if you like, a new set of incentives and policies associated with those incentives to be put in place so that, you know, the two sides of farmers, of the agri-foods contribution is to be made. On the one hand, clear targeted approaches to deal with the issues of emissions, water quality, which in my view is probably the most single important issue, because society is not actually going to tolerate disimprovements in water quality from here on. And the third one is obviously the biodiversity side. But on the other side of the equation then, what steps are we going to start towards, if you like, effectively moving down the road of carbon farming, the whole business of alternative energy on farms, the whole business of anaerobic digestion. And it's getting some clearer balance than is currently in the public mind about that twin-track approach by which the sector is clearly seen to be enthusiastically, non-defensively approaching its future contribution to this problem.
So, Declan, maybe the whole theme of leadership, and we're in Nuffield Scholarship, a room full of leaders within the sector. I mean, how important is leadership and leading out on this in terms of the challenges facing the sector? And it is quite daunting, and it's not clear, but everybody, I suppose, within their own ambit knows that there are things that they could be doing and things that they should be doing. So is leadership to get that collective response and that collaborative response that Karina is talking about, how important is that in this context?
Well, I think it's both important and it's a necessity, because, I mean, clearly the status quo is not sustainable. So there has to be movement forward. And leadership is absolutely crucial in that sense, in terms of both setting out the narrative, also in drawing down the resources, and again, giving the example of innovation. So I think this is a time when there's an unusually rich and fertile field, if you like, for effective leadership. And I think that, I hope, would be the defining characteristic of how we move forward on this. So in sum, it's necessary, and I think there are huge opportunities there.
And Karina, we could sort of build on that in terms of there's a sort of a rallying cry for the industry, and particularly in your area, to bring in that private sector involvement as well, because it is a multi-stakeholder response that is needed for the sector to get things right. So how does that private sector engagement work, and how do you get it? And like, speak a bit to that maybe.
Well, I suppose you could look at it simply that where public money is moving or going into research funding, attracting researchers across our various universities and so on, that there's a necessity within that to have, you know, private sector involvement, because I suppose research in its own right is only a part of the puzzle. What we need then, as Declan has talked about, is to move that on to the innovation space, to the technologies that can be rolled out on farms. So I suppose a lot of the time, if you don't have some private sector involvement at the early stages, well, then the utility of that research can be really limited. But at the same time, and I'm not sure how that balance is struck, but that, you know, that again, the independence and the value of that research is not diminished by having private sector involvement in it, you know, a strong influence of private sector involvement, because then you just get the, well, sure, that's what would be said because. So, you know, but I certainly think, again, with the scale of investment that's going to be required, you know, to get us to where we need to be, that private sector involvement is going to be critical.
I was going to ask her, we have a couple of questions from the floor, maybe as in the last time. I understand that there are some questions that are coming in on Zoom as well, and we will see if we can get to some of those. But I'll take a few questions from the floor. There was a man there who's expressed, and maybe you just might introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. Johnny Butterley, County Louth. I suppose I could say concerned farmer with all that we've been hearing and all that we're aware of going forward. I was very interested to hear Declan touch on it in his contribution about the adoption of organic farming in Ireland, and that it's only 5%, I think you said, which is much less than Europe. And it's sometimes forgotten that Irish farmers have been the custodians of the beautiful green Ireland that we live in and that we continue to live in. And commentators sometimes forget that we wouldn't have the Ireland we have without farmers. But with you saying as well that the green agenda is now mainstream rather than niche, and the pressure that's coming on food supply, like it has always been held that organic farming is fine, but it ain't going to feed the world. So, like, where is it going to be at? Like, is the pressure from Europe and from the non-farming sector going to come on us, who are price takers rather than price setters? Because there's everybody else involved in our business, but they're taking the profits and we're trying to scrape a living. So where is the balance going to be found that we are going to actually be able to produce quality food for the nation's people and make a profit at the same time?
And panel, that's like, that is it's a comment which is consistently heard and very well focused there and very, very genuine, and that is the conundrum that we're actually facing in terms of the future of the agri-food sector. In the context of the organic, I think, you know, eyebrows have been raised in terms that it is a requirement in the Green Deal with the 25% and all, and we sort of feel it doesn't really fit right. You know, we're a grass-based production system. We have a very low carbon emitting production system as it is. But how do we address those policy issues which are coming down the line, which we're feeling don't really fit into our food system? I mean, and Tom, I would have come in up in the strategy.
The whole point of the new generation of CAP strategic plans is they are to be designed to take account of national circumstances. So there actually is no pressure from Europe that Ireland should have 25% of its land in organic production. Equally, there's a completely false debate has started in the last few days that is there an incompatibility between Ireland accepting a global cut of 30% in methane and having a 10% cut in the Irish context. There is no incompatibility with that. So, I mean, I think we have to realise that, you know, that we have the possibility in the CAP strategic plan to frame our policy in a way that suits our circumstances. And it should then, I think, in my view, go back to what's in the Food Vision 2030. But the other thing to be said is that what Tadhg said earlier, of course, is just a reality. That we have essentially, and this has applied during my lifetime, it's not a recent development, you have farm sector divided into a third that are clearly viable, a third that are sort of in between, and then the third that are not viable by any normal standards. That reality is not going to change. So how do you deal with, if you like, the bottom 2/3? And some of it can be, through efficiency gains on farms, perhaps in the second third. But the final, for people that are clearly not operating to a scale, there I think you're into an acknowledgement that the whole notion of social sustainability that is set out in our strategy becomes more relevant. It becomes even more relevant when we see the implications of COVID on settlement patterns, on where people want to live, on the possibility that technology, broadband, can give people opportunities now into the future that they didn't have before. And that's then, that taking a longer term view, that means that younger people coming into the sector who are on farms that clearly are not going to be viable, no matter what they do in efficiency terms, they need skills to acquire that to enable them to live in the rural environment and to do something else in addition to farming.
And Tadhg, that's the whole issue of it could be off farm, but it could be equally on farm in terms of diversification and bringing in there are other opportunities on farm now through the whole agri-environment program that is going to be out there, through funding, through new innovation, everything, that there might be opportunities also on farm for diversification.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the European Commission's analysis on so that at the end of last year, the Commission submitted to each member state key pointers in terms of what they should look at in terms of developing their national strategic plan. And one of the things they pointed out was the availability of a proper rural broadband network, even though it was relating to agriculture, and to the very point that Tom has alluded to. So, what is, and I suppose just to maybe put in context, I think from a messaging point of view, some of the messages that we communicate from an agriculture point of view don't necessarily always resonate with the general public. So, sometimes when we speak about feeding 40 million people, that doesn't always resonate with a lot of people that say, well, sure, just feed 35. So that's we've got to, and that's just the harsh reality of it. And I think that unless or until we have a food security issue, which I wouldn't rule out in the not too distant future, I think that could well change that narrative. But until so when we look at it, and in terms of, I suppose if I just speak about from my own role at the moment, the IFA side of it, we're having an event on Sunday week relating to farm families. So the whole messaging about the future of rural Ireland and the future of farm families, those units, because if we cannot sustain rural Ireland, well then we are looking at a complete breakdown from a social sustainability point of view, which Thomas said. So I think that's much more important to focus on. People that are farming at the moment, their successors may well farm part-time or may do a different type of farming, or different type of farming could be well related to carbon farming on that land. But I have no doubt that if they're given the opportunity to stay in rural Ireland and carry out an agricultural activity, which might be a lot different from what's going on today, they will do it. But they have to be given the opportunity, and that's why we looked. We said our event's on a Sunday, first time ever, and it's because we want to involve the family side of it, and looking at that social sustainability from a rural Ireland perspective. Because if I think about my local parish at home, there is no real employment in that area other than agriculture, or else you commute an hour and 20 minutes to Cork City, and long term, if those people can have ways that they can remain part of those rural communities, which are really, relatively unique in a European context, I think that's a huge positive that we can build on as well.
Yeah. I'm conscious we're running out of time, so we'll keep it a bit brief, but yeah. Andrew.
I just met an economist I know well recently, and I said to him, I don't know whether I'm poisoning the world or feeding the world at the moment with some of the stories that are in the media. Just in the big picture stuff, is is food security and the food policy for both the European Union and world level. There's a billion people or so, I understand, going hungry every day. With the environmental changes and regulations coming in, how is the world going to feed, how are the farmers of the world going to feed the growing world population if less productivity is going to come from, for example, European farming, if it is the case, or world farming? How is that conundrum going to be solved? And I think Declan and Tom, you'd be very well placed and knowledgeable on that. And like, there is a disconnect, particularly in first world countries and Western countries, that the farmers are there, they are producing food, but people go into a shop and they've no connection between that and actually the farmer. It's different in third world countries or developing countries. So even when policy has been developed, some of the policy makers don't understand that connection either. So just from your point of view, how is that world population going to be fed if a cheap food policy is still going to be pursued by Western countries?
Tom, I might just bring it, just as the agricultural economist in all of this, and I'm conscious of time. And I know that the OECD has done some work on this as well, in terms of it is a question of productivity at farm level in developing countries as well. So it's a food systems scenario here. Yeah. So it is, while yes, there will be opportunities and there will be continued opportunities, particularly maybe in terms of the challenges of climate change in other areas that will be called upon for countries like Ireland who have that capability. But at the same time, there is an expectation that at local level that there is a lot of progress that can be made on productivity at local level in developing world as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality is that the world takes food security, or more properly it should be called food and nutrition security, it takes it seriously from time to time when there's a crisis. Yeah. And there's been a limited number of crises over the last 60 years. And if what the facts tell you, if you look at the graphs, is that the real price of food has continued to fall over the last 60 years. And that's a dilemma that, it's a reality facing the sector, and what to do about it. I think we should be beginning to think and build in a bit more contingency against the possibility of some serious food security issues down the tracks, because the role of science or the role of climate in particular areas will have to come into play. The notion that Ireland has got some kind of responsibility, I mean, I think we have a vocation to be a leading producer and exporter of safe, sustainable food. But if we are really looking at issues of global food security, a lot more attention has to be focused on enabling countries that have those food security problems to help solve their own problems. Okay. And that's our role there, should be to encourage that, to support it through our development aid program. But a crucial factor of or outcome of the Food Vision 2030 is an acknowledgement that not only should we be operating sustainable food systems in our domestic policy, but that we should be an advocate for the same type of policies at international level. And that is actually what we are doing. We've had a series of important international meetings, the Food System Summit in September, the current COP. There's another important meeting in December in Tokyo called Nutrition for Growth. And then we will have, in early 2022, an Oceans Summit, which will highlight the question that Kate talked about earlier on, about how increasingly the oceans are going to have to play an increasingly important role in global nutrition. So we have a big story to tell here, but we shouldn't think that solving our contribution to really contributing to solving global food and nutrition security is only about producing food ourselves. It's not. The real secret of dealing with that problem is enabling the countries that have the problem to cope with it themselves. Okay.
I'm very conscious of time, and thank you very much for that. I'm very conscious of time. I just, in the light of the audience that we have here and the conference here, which is all about leadership, I want to finish just the discussion here about asking each one of the panelists to just give us their take on the importance of leadership, or what leadership means to them, or maybe what defined leadership for them in terms of their own leadership journey. I had said 2 minutes, but maybe half a minute might do it, just in terms of the context. But I think it would be interesting, in given that the journey that the new scholars are on, and then maybe the more mature scholars are at a certain stage of their development, that it would be interesting to learn from this panel here as to how important and what does leadership mean for them. And I'm going to start with Declan.
Very, very briefly, I think the most important aspect is to take responsibility, be ready to take responsibility. My favourite pop song is Martha and the Vandellas, which most of you will have never have heard of. A great song called Nowhere to Run to, Nowhere to Hide. And that really is the motto that, in a sense, I've always used. If you want to take leadership, you can't go missing. You have to show responsibility. You have to try and push things forward. And you need to work collegially, both with your team and with all the stakeholders involved. So yes, it's looking for responsibility and activating that. Thanks.
Tom.
Well, I think I've tried to follow a very simple principle for over the last 50 years, and it is whatever you're doing, do it as well as you can, and the future will look after itself.
Karina?
How do I follow those? Okay, that to stretch yourself and make yourself uncomfortable, so to continually challenge yourself, and I think in that space that you probably learn more than you will ever do by not putting yourself into those situations. And I think Gareth mentioned it earlier, you can learn something from everyone you meet. So as part of your Nuffield travels, I think I certainly learned that.
Yeah, this is not a good one to be last on. So I suppose, I think leading by example, one of the things I would say, if I, and maybe this is slightly off topic related to leadership, but if I look at my involvement in Nuffield since 10 or 12 years now, and I look at some of the topics that were covered, like a lot of them were ahead of their time. I think back, and you don't want to be picking out particular people, sustainability, I remember Mary Delaney did a sustainability focus big time on her report, and that stage really, there wasn't a massive focus on it at that stage. I think back to Lark and Allen doing a big focus on the whole carbon sequestration. And again, we had 3 great presentations earlier today, looking at the whole marine side of it, anthelmintics, and about the decision side of it. So I think it's about leading by example, using that, and there's a responsibility that comes with it. But I think that Nuffield has been really, really good at helping people maybe come outside of their normal ecosystem, move outside of it, and feel more comfortable going outside that than maybe is the other thing. And I just want to finish by saying one thing. I know it's John's last conference, John Tyrrell's, and I was treasurer for a while with John, and I'd say John often wanted to choke me when I was treasurer, right? But I have to say he was an absolute pleasure to deal with, and I think he's given an invaluable contribution in Nuffield. So
and a great leader for the sector.
Absolutely,
as well.
and an example we all could follow.
Absolutely. So I think that's a fantastic note to finish the conversation. So I hope we've given you some ideas, some thoughts, and some insight into it. It's not all challenges or opportunities. There's gain and the pain, but I think it's an exciting time ahead for us as well, and it's an exciting time for everybody in terms of leadership and stepping up to the plate and showing what needs to be done. Thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, and everything. I appreciate it.